So yeah, the reason I reached out to you, the reason we wanted to try to have this conversation is because you wrote an article about Rene Girard, which I had heard that guy's name a couple of times, random. I don't know exactly when or who, but like it had entered into my sphere of consciousness, and I knew that I recognized the name when I saw it. I was like, okay, I should probably read this. I need to figure out what this guy's about. But when I got into your article, it was like so many things started clicking as far as just various reading I've been doing lately, and different thought trails I'd been going down. But yeah, maybe you could start by kind of outlining a little bit of I mean, so Evan hasn't read the article, so he's our control here to make sure make sure this all makes sense.
Yeah, it's going to be difficult, Evan, because he is quite like specialist in a way, and like the article requires knowledge in several things, you know, but it's not for everyone. But yeah, we can give it a go for sure.
So I mean, fundamentally, you said in the article, it's like, well, sorry, he's like making sense of all these old mythical traditions, or like trying to kind of crack the code of like, what are all these about, right?
Yeah, so it's really interesting, like his work. Like he goes on a journey with this theory. He develops this theory, and it's not going to be a Christian theory to start with, but it turns into a Christian theory. And in that transformation, he gets loads of insights into what Christianity is in quite an interesting way. And it's definitely not the whole story of what Christianity is, but it's a way of viewing a facet of Christianity, and it's a way of viewing this facet that can be done in a really rational way. So he's a really useful, interesting theorist in that sense.
But the way you explained and kind of told this story is that you almost brought some continuity between, and this is the way I tend to view like looking at mythologies and ancient religions, is that there's a stepping process of like gradually discovering God and discovering this really important story about how to deal with how to understand reality, right? But
yeah, so like a big part of his, I think we should start at the beginning of his theory. Like his first discovery is like mimetic desire, and it's like
explain that.
The best way of understanding it is like a way of explaining how micro interactions between people work, and like tiny little ways that our social lives like resolve themselves between each other. And he realizes that it's based around desire, how we desire things, and how other people desire things.
Yeah, can you give like an example of a mimetic, like, because I couldn't totally wrap my mind around that word. I mean, I almost read it like from a Dawkins perspective, like mimetic desire, but mimetic is a different word.
Yeah, it's very different. It's very confusing because it's said in exactly the same way. So it's a really bad conflict there. So it's spelt with an I, and it refers to mimicry. It refers to desire based around mimicry, and it's you desire something because somebody else desires something. Basically, it's just the form of desire that we observe in children all the time. Like, you know, your daughter wants something because your son wants something.
Yeah.
You know, your daughter wants something because your son has something.
Yeah.
And like, obviously it's like really important in children's behavior, but Girard is saying that it's really fundamental to human life, and especially was fundamental to human life in the earliest societies, like tribal groups. We can't relate it easily to our society because our society is so different from those early societies. So yeah, so he looks into great works of literature, and he sees that they're all based around these this way of desiring, that you desire something because somebody else desires something, and this form of desire, which is so fundamental to people, inevitably leads to conflict. So it's behind the conflict of the characters in these works, and he discovers this in these great works of literature. He's a literary professor, And he goes from that place to looking into anthropology, and he looks at like tribal anthropology, and he discovers that this form of desire and rivalry is like really fundamental to like the mythologies that the tribes have, and therefore fundamental to the rituals that they use to like manage their societies, which is what rituals are used for. And he goes from there into creating his theory, which is a theory about sacrifice.
Right. And yes, see if we can get there to get explaining why does like mimetic desire. So I mean, just to cap that off, we have mimetic desire. It's almost like it's how you transcend yourself and be part of a bigger group wanting something. It's like if individuals just want something, then they all go after it on their own. But if somehow we figure out a way to copy each other, we resolve into a larger entity that could pursue something together, right?
Actually, not really, but like, yeah, the way that this mimetic desire, which is basically desire between individuals, relates to a group is quite difficult. It's quite difficult for us to understand. Basically, for our purposes, we're looking at the group being the place where this mimetic desire is taking place. The mimetic desire happens between individuals, but because it's happening between all of the different individuals at once, there's loads of crossovers. So it turns into this group dynamic, which is basically this kind of dangerous group conflict where everybody just basically gets into conflict with each other. Like
where's the conflict coming from? It's like people wanting something and they can't have it.
It's just people. Yeah, I think that like basically Girard puts this mimesis, which is wanting what your model, what this person who you have, who has become your model, wanting what they have, and he puts this at the center of everything, and this is fundamental to his theory, and it makes his theory into this kind of semi-scientific theory. But I don't agree with putting it at the center of everything. What I think is important is that you see it as a you see it as a way of understanding. You just see it as a way of explaining why interactions between humans result in conflict, and you can best understand it as analogously as the Blood Feud. Like, somebody wrongs me and I have to take revenge against them, and then that escalates because their family has to take revenge on my family, and then a cycle of revenge happens, and the whole, like, everybody is going to be brought into that cycle of revenge. Like, there's no way of escaping it.
Because so if I want revenge and there's other people that like look at me as sort of a role model, is it role on? Maybe that's not quite the right word, but somebody looks at me and it's through that mimetic desire. Now they want revenge too. Like, through me, they enter into my story, and like now we want revenge on that guy, and then it kind of spreads. And is that how the escalation kind of works? So
like mimetic theory is like this. It's quite a technical way of understanding interactions between people, and it's quite difficult to explain. And I don't 100% agree with it.
Okay,
but you can. Like, but his theory is like important far beyond this original concept. So mimetic theory is a little bit like Darwin's theory of evolution. Okay, so the theory of evolution depends on the survival of the fittest, right? You understand everything through the survival of the fittest. Everything in Darwin's theory can be understood through the survival of the fittest, and that's what makes it a scientific theory. Right. So that helps it to be a theory that is acclaimed in academia, is acclaimed in science, and becomes a fundamental part of knowledge. That's what Girard is trying to do with his theory. In order to make it scientific, in order to make it rational, he's trying to reduce human relations to this one thing, which is mimetic desire. And I think that he's doing that to make his theory into a rational scientific theory. I think that he was really excited about his discovery of mimesis, but like I think that that's why he makes the concept so fundamental. What I'm trying to say to you is that I don't think it's super important to explain the theory through mimesis.
Okay.
You need to understand mimesis as just a way of describing micro-social interactions between people. Like, we're living next door to each other, and mimesis is why we enter into conflict over time. And it's basically because I want what you have. And, you know, it's more complicated than that, but like, you know, it's just a way of describing why people who next to each other, why people within families, why neighbors come into conflict. But it's the conflict that's the important part. Like, the technical description of why the conflict happens, I think is a little bit difficult to get into. It's very technical and it's a little bit misleading.
Okay.
But the blood feud, like, say I get into a conflict with my neighbor, right? And that results in violence and I kill my neighbor. In ancient societies and in many current societies, that means that my victims' relatives have are honor bound to take revenge on me. And when they take revenge on me, my relatives are honor bound to take revenge on them. And then the cycle just keeps going. So the initial emergence of conflict, which is through this micro technical theory called mimetic theory, turns into this blood feud. And the blood feud threatens the whole group, threatens the tribe, because everybody will be drawn into the conflict in like 100% with 100% reliability. Everybody will be drawn into the conflict. There's no way to stop the conflict from happening. This is the mimetic crisis. So this is the crisis that threatens the early group, the early tribe. So Girard says the tribe, because of these tiny little micro interactions between people, conflict happens, and then violence happens, and then violence just spreads through the group, and the whole group is threatened with destruction because, because they're
going to kill each other, basically.
Yeah. So, faced with destruction, the group either destroys itself, and that is possible. So he goes into like lots of anthropology in his work, and he looks at this group. There's this anthropologist called Jules Henry. He's wrote a book called The Jungle People, and it's about this tribe in South America where this happens. They self-destruct. They basically commit social suicide.
Really? Okay.
For Girard, because like they don't have a way of managing this violence.
Right. So unless you discover this sort of story about how to deal with the violence or the sin that's in all of us, you just go extinct. So any tribe that has continued to exist, they've sooner or later they've figured out a version of this story and they act it out in ritual. Yeah.
So what they find, so everything's going crazy, right? Everybody, like, violence is threatening the group. And at a certain point, just as the violence and the danger reaches its climax, then instead of everybody conflicting with each other, people suddenly single out somebody to blame for the violence. They suddenly see one individual as to blame for everything that's going wrong in the group, for all of the violence that's happening in the group. And that individual is what we now know as the scapegoat. And that individual is violently killed. And when they kill that individual, that is what solves the crisis. And everything is resolved.
Well, it seems like it's like, okay, obviously there's so many stories that seem to play this out, and like there's so many so many ancient cultures seem to have like sacrifice rituals, and what's that all about? And so this sort of like, okay, that solves it, but how on earth does it solve it? Because that person wasn't the problem, right?
Yeah, but yeah, right. So they weren't the problem, but you believe that everybody believes that they were the problem.
Right. Well, and then at least solves the problem of all the anxiety that people have built up, like looking for a way, like that they've been wanting to vent this anxiety, this anger towards somebody or something, and now they have a point that they can say, oh, well, that's the bad thing. We're just gonna throw all of our anger, throw all of our rage at that.
Yeah. So the obvious modern example is the Jews in Nazi Germany, right? So.
I was going to say
the Nazis make it clear to everybody that the Jews are to blame for all of the problems during the 1920s that Germany was facing, and their loss in World War One, and everybody blames them, and like it kind of works. Like Germany gets back on its feet financially. And everybody else, apart from the Jews, like all of the other German people, are unified, right? It creates unification in the group because you're able to identify this other, exclude them, and then you are unified. Right. But it is important to keep it on the tribal level. So, like, when this individual, like people just believe that they are the person. Like it. We don't really know why they believe that the person is to blame. I think that they just have to, and they just make a mythology around it. They construct a mythology around it because the alternative is the destruction of the group.
Yeah. Sorry, we're probably gonna have a couple moments like that. There's a little bit of a delay here, so I couldn't hear when you started talking. But,
all right, cool, man.
But yeah, I mean, so once you'd gotten kind of to that you'd laid that much out in your article, all these gears started turning in my head, especially after recently spending a little bit of time reading some Freud stuff. Yeah. And I was like, oh, this is the same. Well, at least I tend to, whenever I read anything, I just think everything's the same.
Yeah.
But somehow I saw that process of like, okay, on an individual level, this is like the suppression, and then the like various mental disorders or like things like anxiety or depression, or like even more serious things like schizophrenia, or like what's the one that makes you yell? Yeah. Tourette's. Yeah. Okay. There's various different. Basically, our bodies sort of discover ways of letting out all of the pressure of built up anxieties, and it's a very simple. It's just like and Freud kind of he use this sort of analogy of like a pipe system of emotions a lot in like as far as like inside of us. It's like we're just a bunch of pipes, and if like you get a lot of pressure built up in one spot, it's got to go somewhere. And then if you see somebody like with Tourette's start yelling, or maybe they just totally turn off and they start cowering in fear, or they start yelling and screaming at people, or they go and murder someone, right?
No, I think that's a really good way of understanding it. Like it is a good analogy for that mechanic. So after that happens, then the social crisis threatens again after that.
Right.
So, but instead of
because you haven't solved the problem.
It didn't solve the problem in the long term. It didn't solve the problem of conflict in our societies in the long term, obviously. So, but instead of like replaying the whole thing, people start to develop ritual in order to do the same thing symbolically.
Yeah.
So you replay the crisis and you replay the resolution to the crisis, but this time it's a symbolic ritual and it's not an actual murder, although it could be a human sacrifice, for instance, for Girard. And then because that would initially be human sacrifice, then for Girard, he says that all of the other instances of sacrifice are like versions of this human murder.
Which, like, basically, the modern version of that story is like the super villain, or like it's just the villain. Like it's like you have one person to point at and blame all the problems at, and then we get to kill that guy, and then everything's all better.
Yeah, I think maybe the villain is a good analogy for it. So that's his theory. That's his theory as it initially was. And he begins to look at, he continues, he's very excited about his discovery, and he begins to like look through various anthropological texts, continues to read anthropology, and then he comes to the Bible, and he expects the Bible to tell the same. Oh, sorry. So we're missing a step.
Okay.
So when it becomes formulated into ritual, then you create mythologies, right? You create stories for why you're doing the ritual. You create stories that explain the ritual, and the stories always have to conceal what's happening in this scapegoating, in this resolution to the crisis. It always has to conceal and yet recreate the scapegoating. So basically, it has to identify somebody as being like a troublemaker, a weirdo, an evil person, and like explain away the attacks on him. And like, yeah, it's just got to conceal the innocence of that person.
Right. So
he looked into lots of mythologies, and he saw that they did do this concealing.
Yeah.
And he looked at so he came to the Bible, and he expected the Bible to repeat this process, like to be another mythology, because he was an atheist at the time. So he looks at the Bible, and he sees the opposite. He sees the opposite to what he was expecting. Instead of concealing the innocence of the victim, the Bible explicitly reveals, or in the Old Testament kind of partially reveals the innocence of the victim. And this is the first book, mythology or book, to do this.
Well, because another element you said, though, is that after they, all gang up on that one person and then filter all of their rage into that person and kill them or something, they tend to like be like deified afterwards, as like, now this person is sort of the savior of their sins.
Yeah, that's quite an important part of his theory. It's quite difficult to get into, though.
Okay.
And I'm not sure what thoughts did you have regarding that?
Well, so as I was thinking about this, I started kind of seeing it play out on two different levels. Or like, so there's the Girardian version of the story where you find something negative, and then you filter all of your rage onto it and kill it or cast it out, and you've at least gotten rid of all that excess anxious energy you had towards, like, whether as an individual or whether as a family or whether as a whole community or tribe of people, right? You finally you have one thing to point at and to filter all your rage into it and kill it, and then, well, now that it's actually, it's made you all feel better, you look at it and that's something actually to be thankful for, and then it becomes this good thing. There's really good connotation to it. But then I saw also we kind of do an invert of that as well, where we have positive desire kind of build up in us that is kind of unresolved as well. We have like maybe we have a lot of advertisements for greasy foods and things like that. Yep. And we get these like all week, and it's like, oh, I really want to eat something delicious. And then we finally go and buy a dozen donuts, and it's like, this is going to be the best thing ever. We filter all of that desire into this one object and just feel like we have this explosion of happiness, and then suddenly we feel so terrible, and we look at that box of donuts and say, you're the cause of all my problems. You're horrible, right? There's the same kind of flip of response. I just noticed that where it's like, we have pornography and we have idolatry, right? We either, or no, sorry, we have like pornography, which is idolatry, or we have like scapegoating. We either look at something and filter all of our, this is just the easy way out of dealing with a problem. We filter all of our desire onto a thing or all of our rage onto a thing, but it at least gets rid of all that desire juice anyways, like the libido that Freud talks about.
Yeah, he basically says that like this is the origin story behind a lot of the gods and heroes, that they are the scapegoat, and he links it to scapegoat kings, which existed in a lot of ancient societies and a few contemporary tribes as well, where the king is like ritually killed at the end of their reign.
Right, in the I think it's Zagmuk ritual is for the Mesopotamians. They gang up on their king, and they either kill him or they have like a thief stand in, and he like pretends to be the king, and then they kill the thief at the end of and then they resurrect the king. But I thought that was interesting because they kind of blame it all on a political figure or the leader, and that's sort of what we do. You know, every time we have an election cycle, we say, okay, all of our problems, they were that president's fault. Now it's going to be this new guy, and he's going to solve all the problems.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, I like you. The reason why I didn't concentrate on this deification aspect is that it would create loads of extra problems with how I was relating it to the Lord of Spirits podcast. You know? Yeah,
because they, for some reason, those guys have some difficulty seeing, or like they want to say that the Christian story is like totally different, or
they just concentrate on the angels and demons, which comprise the hierarchies. They concentrate on these real existing entities. And I don't think Girard really thinks that those kind of things exist. So that is just a huge difference between them that I didn't want to introduce into the article. So what I'm trying to say is because I didn't introduce it into the article, I haven't really thought about it, very deeply. Sure. Next is just the Christian Christian turn and the relevance of the theory to Christianity, which is another huge subject.
Yeah, well, and this is the part I really wanted to get into with you, because I like just telling that story. It's like, okay, that makes sense that's the Christian story in some sense, and like the Christian story just like it just takes it to its logical conclusion. It doesn't like subvert it totally. It just like goes further and says, okay, let's get down even lower and let's deal with the problems as low as we can go. And it's like that doesn't seem to be like a hard left or right turn in the development of this story. It's just like, okay, it's continuing that story down on the to lower and lower structures of consciousness.
Continuing which story? Sorry.
Well, I mean this Girardian story that he sort of discovered of like, you have these energies built up of negative or positive, and you need to eventually you get to a threshold of, okay, now there's enough that I'm angry, or there's some negative pressure built up here, and I need to aim this somewhere. Like I'm angry. There's a lot of little problems here. How am I going to deal with them? You find what seems to be the biggest problem, and you aim all the energy at that, and then you say all of your problems are gone, but really you've just kind of solved one of them. Like, I mean, even within all these stories, it's like whenever we tell a story about a bad guy, it's like if we take the story apart, we can even see that, okay, it's really just a human, and that not everything even about that character is bad, but like we're using it as this Girardian scapegoat thing.
The Bible is different from everything else because it unveils and thus completely ruins this method that we've just been discussing. So instead of finding an innocent victim, and putting the problems on that victim and killing them or exiling them, the Bible shows to us through its stories. The Old Testament shows to us through several of its stories, and then the New Testament shows to us explicitly through Christ's death that the victim was innocent. Therefore, the whole thing is broken. The whole thing doesn't work anymore. And you have to understand that this was, according to Girard, this was the way that societies, that groups of humans managed themselves. It was like their legal system, basically. It was like an alternative legal system. It was the way that they kept their groups stable. And it worked. It worked in keeping the group stable. It worked in stopping this buildup of aggression and violence between people. So when Christianity, or also Judaism to an extent, shows that the victim is innocent, it doesn't work anymore. And that's why Christianity is so important. And that's why it's so different to what came before.
But if, I mean, so like, this is what I'm talking about as far as it going down a level of consciousness. So it's like, okay, within the group singles out a particular piece of it, a particular human in that group, and blames everything on that group. That human probably is partially responsible for the problems. Mm-hmm. I mean, they're innocent at least of all of the problems, but they're not innocent of. Yeah. And so the group, filters all that energy onto that one person and gets rid of them, and then it feels like it's kind of solved the problem. It seems to me like literally what Jesus teaches us to do is to like repent of our sins, like focus on a particular part of ourself that we can like basically go as low as we can go and like look at our, as John Vervaeke has, like our consciousness congress, look at all the little parts that make us up and find the one that we think is causing the problem and like kind of say, oh, here's my sin. I'm going to offer this up to God and I'm going to blame all my problems on that sin.
Yeah. Maybe, I'm not sure. Maybe he does that. I think he does like so many, Jesus just does so many different things. Like, and his teachings are like manifold. Like the golden rule is like a Christian, and it's also in other religions. Like it's a technology that deals with this mimetic crisis. It's a technology that deals with conflict.
Right. But a lot of Christians tend to even take the golden rule and like say, okay, well, this didn't like come from anything else. This was just a totally new thing that happened. Like to me, I see a continuity there. It's like the oldest version is like whatever the Code of Hammurabi or whatever, something like don't do to your neighbor what you don't want them to do to you. But then when we get to Christianity, it becomes a positive and instructional, like actually do to your neighbor what you want him to do to you. And it's like that doesn't seem like, again, it doesn't seem like an opposite or like a hard turn of like something totally different. It's just like expanding on that process. Like, oh, how much further could we take this?
No, I agree. That is not an opposite, but there's loads of other aspects of the Christian message and story which are unique and revolutionary. And for Girard, like bringing it back to Girard, he was convinced of its uniqueness because Christianity is the only thing which explicitly and centrally uncovered the scapegoating process in a social sense, and just showed it to be what it is, and thus destroyed it. He ended its power, basically.
But I mean, those stories are still like you could still find that pattern in the stories we've continued to tell about ourselves, even within sort of the Christian tradition. I feel like, I mean, even.
Yeah, so scapegoating is still around, is what you mean.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that's like, but we see it, we know what it is, we can name it. Like before that's part of the Christian revolution, is that we know it's there and we can name it, we know what it is, and we know that it's bad, we know that it's wrong. So that's like a huge difference from before, and it means that we can build on it.
It just feels like we're like, so we haven't, I don't know. I just, it feels a little bit wrong to say that like we end that story. I just feel like we recognize that we're playing out that story, and so we do it a little bit more carefully or something like that.
Yeah, I mean, this is like, it's a very difficult. It's very, yeah. Christianity has failed to an extent, and as Jonathan Pageau has said many times, that prediction is already contained within Christianity. Like that's in the Apocalypse, that's in the Book of Revelation. Like that is, for Girard, he says that is the failure of Christianity, because that is he thinks that it's a human created war. Revelation is a human created conflict or war that will happen, and that is the failure of Christianity. And then after that, Christ will come again and things will be healed again. I think that, yeah, the fact that scapegoating is still present in our society, it's to do with all of the things that Jonathan Pageau covers. It's to do with the ways in which Christianity has failed in the West. It's to do with the Enlightenment. It's to do with yeah, it just brings all of those things into the conversation, and it's a big one.
Okay, so can we jump back to the goats for a second? Because you were talking briefly
Sure.
about Azazel or like, because specifically, I'm not sure if we've actually got into this yet, but within the way that the Jewish tradition worked, like the way Israel did the scapegoating thing, they had like they did like a day of atonement. They had a day of like of reuniting themselves or of like covering themselves, bringing some unity back to the group. And that the way they did that was through picking out two animals. Are they both goats, or is it just one a goat?
Both goats.
Okay. Yeah, and so they have one that's like a sacrifice to God and one that's for Azazel, which is like, who knows who that guy is? He's only in scripture a couple times, but like...
Yeah, he's basically Satan. I think that he's like... I'm pretty sure that he's Satan. I think the Lord of Spirits guys might disagree with me. I'm not sure.
Well,
I think he is
at least a character of evil, right?
Yeah.
There's a character in the or no, it's not the Marvel. Well, maybe actually it might be in the extended Marvel universe, but in the X-Men characters, there's a guy named Azazel who's like, he literally is like this demonic entity, and he's trapped in the demonic realm. Have you heard of this guy?
So many fantasy names are taken from the Old Testament. It's a really cool name, like in terms of its evil power, Azazel.
What's even crazy about it is I was just reading like the wiki page for this guy, and so he's not able to get to Earth. He's like trapped in his demonic realm or whatever. But he like manages to get himself like into Earth in some ways by like seducing different women so they can bear his children, and then his children will walk the Earth. But then the only women that can actually hold his children, because they're like he's such an evil entity, he's all like superhero women. So he impregnates the character Mystique, and she has his child. And when people find out that she has a demon baby, they literally play out the Goat of Azazel story on her. And the whole town blames all of their problems on Mystique, and they run her to the edge of town and like spit on her and say, you know, damn you to hell. You're the problem. You're the cause of all of our problems. And then and then it happens on a microcosm. She does the same thing with her baby, and she says, if it wasn't for you, I would be, and she kind of blames all of her own personal issues on this baby and throws the baby off of a cliff, which is exactly what happens in the Israelite story too, right?
Yeah, they probably copied they probably just copied the story.
Yeah, well, I thought it was a great way to even just to bring that story to light, because you can follow these characters. It's not quite as detached with like, you know, being an ancient text. It's like this was that story, but brought kind of for a current viewer or reader.
Bringing in these goats is going to really confuse Evan.
Yeah,
Are you following so far?
When you guys were talking about the scapegoat, I was thinking like the Israelites probably thought that their goats were like, I thought the whole thing was that they had to bring a pure animal to sacrifice, right? So that connection was kind of already there.
They had the Innocence thing. Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah, so Girard says that the animals that were selected for sacrifice in other tribes, maybe not the Jews, are the ones which are like as close to humans as possible, which have like kind of human characteristics, rather than the ones which are pure, so that they can stand in for humans. For the Jewish Day of Atonement ritual, I'm not sure if that's true at all. But this Day of Atonement ritual, Evan, this is like of absolutely central importance to the Jewish practices before Christ's birth. And then it's like central to the Christian story, because these guys in the Lord of Spirits podcast, they explain how Christ fulfills the purpose of the ritual of the Day of Atonement through his death and resurrection. That's what he's doing. He's performing this cleansing, bonding ritual of the Day of Atonement. He's fulfilling that ritual for the whole world. He's performing the ritual for the whole world rather than just Israel. And that's what he's. So it's really important to understand the Christian story, to understand this Day of Atonement ritual, which contains these two goats.
Well, so we understand one of the goats, or at least like the whole Girardian story we've talked about so far. That makes sense of the goat for Azazel. We have one that we can kind of blame all the problems on. Why is there two goats?
So the other goat is the kind of positive sacrifice. It's the Petersonian sacrifice. It's the offering up to God of some of our earthly material to receive a purification or a blessing or a kind of informing from him from above. And this is the version of sacrifice that Girard can't see in his work, and it's one of the reasons why Girard's work is kind of faulty, and he can't see this version of sacrifice as being positive, basically.
Yeah, because that is a fundamentally different sort of sacrifice. I mean, when you sacrifice the negative stuff, it's like that's not even a sacrifice. That's like just a freedom from to yourself. Like you're just getting rid of what you don't want.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and yeah, I think it should be related on the everyday level to, I think, Peterson's self-sacrifice, but it should also be an important part of our kind of ritual life. But it's just not, because we don't have a ritual life. But so what I'm saying is it's quite hard to understand in everyday terms.
Yeah, well, it's almost our personal rituals trend more towards that Girardian type story of like I was saying, like buying donuts and letting, like that's literally a version of that ritual of like, okay, I'm going to let all this positive desire out, or finding a scapegoat and looking and saying, that's the guy, he's the one who's all my problems. And usually it's like a lot of people tend to like take all their life's problems and blame them on their boss. Or blame them on their parents, or blame them on the church that brought them up. If they find somebody who's like easy to point at and like who can, I guess, sort of take it too, because they're like they have some structure to them, and so like obviously they've done some things wrong, and so it's easy to point to them, just like like the Mesopotamians point at their king and kind of mock him.
Mm-hmm.
Probably the modern equivalent maybe for that self-sacrifice would be like a tithe, maybe. Or no?
That's definitely one of the aspects of it. Yeah, it's a really good insight, actually. That's that is an offering up to what is higher than you, and that's like part of the structure between us and the authorities, right? And that's like the relationship between humanity and God, but on a lower level, for sure. Yeah. So like a tithe is definitely a form of offering.
How do you like?
What's really interesting is that structure is so similar to these little online hierarchies that are being created, like under Jordan Peterson or Jonathan Peugeot or all these other influencers, because they have people who give a tithe to them, and they give meaning and information down in exchange.
Oh, like with the Patreon thing.
Yeah,
that's interesting.
Like that's the whole structure of the online economy. Like all of the followers of these people like give a certain amount of material to them in the form of a certain subscription, and they give their words in return.
Would OnlyFans be a hybrid of your two ghosts? You're sacrificing up 10%. And
it's difficult to.
Your
Well, it is sort of like you're getting. Oh man, that's that might take a minute to unpack, because it seems like both of them at the same. You said it's like a hybrid, because you're on one hand you're sort of filtering all this positive desire that you're getting, because like especially within our modern advertising culture, there's so many sexual prompts almost everywhere. Right, everything's being sold with sex, and so you have all this unmet like libido, and then you're like, where am I going to put this? And so you kind of do that, and that's the pornographic element of, right. It's like you imagine that's going to solve all of your problems, and it sort of does. At least it resolves all of that pressure that's built up for a second, but it hasn't solved. It doesn't, for one thing, it hasn't solved the societal problem of us marketing with sex so much. And then your personal problem of you kind of exposing yourself to so much of that type of advertisement or whatever. But the idea of giving up your first fruits to the goddess of sex and having the meaning. I don't know. Yeah, maybe you could explain that pattern though a little bit more of as far as like, okay, so you give up some thing and then you get meaning in exchange.
Yeah, it's so the idea is basically formulated in Mathieu Pajot's book Language of Creation, and he basically portrays it as like a structure of reality. It's the way that humans can interact with the divine fundamentally, but then it's also a way that microcosms of that structure interact with each other. For instance, governments and the people under them, or YouTuber influencers and Patreon subscribers and stuff like that. So, but most importantly, it is the relationship between humans and the divine. So humans give offerings to the divine through like burnings or other forms of sacrifice, and the divine gives meaning in exchange, or information, or it forms what is below it through, I suppose, the logos.
So,
but it's a very I am not an expert on this process. It's very difficult to understand, and I don't think I can give an authoritative version of it, to be honest. I can basically like that.
See if you can riff on it a little bit with us here, though. Like,
sure.
Because, well, I mean, so what? See if this at least makes sense with your understanding of the concept. So, like, you talked about like giving, like with the Patreon thing. That I think that's an interesting example that lands anyways. But like when you're giving up money to God that literally can't spend it, it's a little bit. There's a little bit of a disconnect there. But like within maybe the structure of a family, if maybe it's the economy of attention, maybe that makes bridges a little bit of a gap, because if you spend time if you spend time with your family, in exchange for that, you get a covering. You get a sense of feeling like you're part of a larger structure. And so there's a larger meaning to your life than just being an individual. It's like now you've become something bigger. You've entered into a larger structure that is your family. And you reaffirm that every time you pay the tithe of your attention of like focusing on the fact that you are part of a family. Yeah. So like,
I think attention is definitely relevant to it, although it's not. Maybe attention is an offering,
because that's like, by they're doing this ritual, this story of like burning an animal to the altar, but like what's happening, it seems like they're spending this time, they're gathering around, they have a visual element to kind of play the story out on, but they're aligning all of their attention on this idea of like God is unifying us. God is going to, like, so I mean, for one thing, it brings some cohesion to the group, like we are being redeemed, but also like we are submitted to God, and we're part of God's structure, God's covering.
Yeah. Your camera's gone out again, Garrett.
Yikes. I think I had this a couple weeks ago. I was having a chat with another guy from the UK. It seems like we just don't have great servers, or Google doesn't have great servers between.
Yeah, it might also be my connection. My connection's not amazing. Yeah. We're still pretty backwards here in the UK in some places, unfortunately.
I'll go reset my camera real quick and see if that fixes it.
Cool, man. So, are you like reading into this stuff, Evan, in general?
I would say I'm pretty out of the loop for the most part on all this. I know names and I've listened to a few videos, but I don't really read a lot of the same books. So,
but you're still interested in Garrett's project with his channel.
Yeah. I like the overarching things. I just haven't been as focused on the specifics as he is probably. Like I think in general he's at a different place, more philosophically, where I'm just like, I got to study for an exam, so I'll focus on that right now.
I've been honestly though using Evan as a bit of a grounding, because I feel like I have a tendency to, whenever I get kind of interested in a new idea or a new hobby, I'll tend to just like, that becomes my whole world if I'm not careful. And I like this stuff is just, it's really interesting to me right now. But I feel like I'm running the risk of like just becoming not interesting to talk to if I get too deep in it. And so I go and I try to talk to Evan about some new philosopher I've just discovered, and he'll counter me by talking about some new episode of like Theo Vaughn's podcast and the hilarious crap that's going on over there. And I'm like, yeah, you're right. I need to go listen to some more funny stuff. I need to go and experience other things.
Hopefully this whole thing will become more grounded in time. Will have more of a formal structure where you can really learn something, and learn something with other people. Because at the moment we're all kind of finding our own way. Yeah. And the only structure that we can point to is the church,
Yeah.
Or the university. But I think that maybe there's a place for like knowledge structures like right here, because it's like it's kind of what we're trying to do. We're trying to figure things out, and we're trying to get things down, but it can get lost, and as you say, you can just get lost in information, and people can just not know what you're talking about.
Well, what are the other fears? So I mean, like, I feel like that kind of plays into something I've been thinking about, that I'm a little afraid of with this community, and even kind of watching Jonathan Peugeot a little bit. Like, he's very, I mean, he's had a huge status thing attached to going down this trail of like finding meaning, finding symbols, and explaining everything through symbolism. And so, like, obviously there's good incentive to keep doing that. But I mean, he talks about this idea of like the fall as being like going and beginning to try to incorporate too low of information into yourself, that you can't eat that information, or you can't incorporate it into yourself, and so it's like rejected, or you suddenly, like, your whole view, your larger sense of view of meaning falls apart, and like he talks about even that. So that's the story of eating the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. But like a recent example I thought of is like, okay, if you're really young, you see somebody in a mailman outfit and you know they're a mailman. You learn that that's what a mailman is. But if you haven't learned to comprehend, do any abstract thinking yet, if you're not able to kind of preserve a sense of meaning about a person, they take off that mailman outfit and you see them as somebody else. You can't actually comprehend them being a mailman anymore. It's like you've lost that meaning. You've tried to incorporate something in that's sort of like a lower level of meaning of that person, despite their sort of sociological role or whatever, like them being something. And it's like, if you can't remember that, then like you've tried to incorporate information that's too low, and you've lost your comprehensive meaning story about the world. Does that make sense? Is that a good example?
I don't know.
Yeah, I think that that people in Jordan Peterson's position or Jonathan Peugeot's position, they're facing a very difficult situation. Like from our perspective, it seems like it's all great for them, but they're really in a very scary position, and you can see this coming out in the conversation that Peugeot and Peterson had together.
Yeah.
If you listen carefully to what Peterson is saying, like, his fame to his followers and the idolization that people accorded to him, it clearly was part of the stress that was on him, like, it's just him being at the top of one of these hierarchies and being made into one of these mythological figures. Right. And he didn't, it's so, we don't know what it's like, but it's a really intense thing. I think that in comparison, Jonathan Peugeot is managing it really well, but he is facing a lot of psychologically dangerous areas. And
well, I think I was going to say that the fear I have for him is that he's, like, because he's had such positive reinforcement for beginning to see like the symbolic meaning of everything, I feel like there's a lower limit of trying to incorporate knowledge that's too low, but I feel like there's an sort of an upper limit as well. And if you breach that, you begin to get into something rather than, getting into nihilism. The inverted version of that problem is like paranoia or like a quixotic, like, hyper interpretive, hyper pattern seeking version of reality. And like it seems like
Yeah.
he's genuinely really concerned that the real end times are here or something. Maybe I'm misreading what's going on or what's going on inside. I haven't talked to him personally, but like,
oh, he definitely does think that, and that we were talking about it on the Discord recently, and yeah, you're right. Like when you're in the symbolic perspective, when you're in the symbolic mindset, if you encounter something like any entity, like a tweet, for instance, or any piece of media, you've kind of got to take it seriously. It kind of enters into your perceptions, I think, in a very powerful way. I mean, it does for everybody, you know. But I think that like if you've been looking at the media environment for a long time, and I started studying it in 2017, and you go down, say, the political science route or something like that, then maybe you or I would start to be suspicious about the information which you're receiving and say, well, this is about the algorithm or this is about X and Y, you know, and like start to be a bit cynical about the stories which you're being told through the internet. But I think for Jonathan, the stories are always very real, you know, and I think that that's a necessary consequence of the being in that symbolic mindset. And I don't think we should be critical really about it, because he manages it so well and he's so insightful about all of these things that are happening. And I think that even though it's healthy for the rest of us to be cynical about some of them, like they still all have meaning. They still all have meaning which should be interpreted by a talented person like Peugeot, you know?
Yeah, well, so like the question is, how do you have faith in somebody or a concept or even in God when you sort of like, or even in the story, in one of these stories of like getting meaning by sacrificing or getting like getting rid of all of your anxiety and stuff through the scapegoat thing. How do you believe in those stories once you kind of how they work? It's like sorry, maybe that's a bit of a loose connection, but like, so looking at somebody and seeing that they have flaws, but still looking up to them or still like respecting, is like, how do you personally judge somebody who clearly knows more than you, but you can see that there's some issues, but you're not really sure where the line of those issues ends, you know?
Yeah, that's one of the problems which is emerging. It's the problem of hierarchy, and it's the problem of how do we relate to these people that are in a different place? Like, you can't communicate with people who have attained a certain degree of fame. Like, you just can't directly communicate with them because they're getting too much information. The way that they relate to information just changes. But I think that these things are really in early days, you know. I want to write my next article about this subject, actually, like the nature of these little online hierarchies and like how they might change or how they might get more formalized, you know.
Get more formalized? What do you mean?
Well, you know, hierarchies have to be, so like, let's take Jordan Peterson, right? So he has millions of people who are kind of below him in these little hierarchical structures. Like, he's talking to them, they're giving him attention and money, you know. But the structure with Jordan Peterson and all his followers got kind of fucked up and chaotic, and it got overly dramatic for him, and it turned into this stressful situation,
right? And
yet his followers can't communicate with him. So like, maybe that chaotic situation could be resolved by adding steps in between Jordan Peterson and the level of the followers. And I think that that's what hierarchy does. It adds levels in between the top and the bottom of the hierarchy.
Right.
It stratifies the hierarchy. And I think that maybe that's one of the steps in the formalization of these hierarchies that could happen. I'm not sure.
I think just the way you just described that kind of story actually made a little connection for me. So it's like in our relationship. So this is kind of bringing it back to like an idol worship type thing. So if we take the kind of inverted version of the Girardian story of like focusing all our desire on a particular thing, then we finally sort of we begin to celebrate it as if it's like the meaning of existence. And then once we've got all that energy out, then we can finally see it for what it is and see that it wasn't all that we made it up to be. And then it becomes an object of, in the same way that the goat of Azazel becomes like a deity that saves you. That becomes a thing that's like something that's just detestable, like totally annoying. And this is like, you see this so much in the deconstructionist kind of Christian movement of like people who like, they put so much on their church or so much on their religion or their particular pastor or whatever as like, this is it. This is how you got to live life. And there was no intermediary steps of like actually, pointing to some little new states of being in between there. It was just like they put all of their positive energy aimed it at one particular person, and then they let them down. And then suddenly, okay, actually Christianity is the worst, and all of my problems are. Dude, we kind of swap back and forth between these things. But it's like that's what some people are having that experience with Jordan Peterson. And I feel like on a micro scale, I've even had that happen with each one of these guys. Like I said, I tend to get really obsessive whenever I find an idea that seems interesting to me. So like for me, it was like, oh, Peterson, that guy has all the ideas. Like this is everything I need right now. And then I got to a point and I was like, actually, this guy's kind of bothering me a little bit. I think I'm kind of done. But it's like, how do you avoid doing that?
Yeah. So if there's more substance to the idea structures that these people create and their followers, then maybe you can spread the pressure out, and there's not so much pressure on those people, and there's not so much idolization from on our side of these people.
So it's literally just a matter of kind of being too isolated. It's like, okay, if you're going to participate in a church or a large, even using the word hierarchy. So you see like this kind of branching structure. If there's literally just one stump and then there's all the branches and there's no intermediary steps there, that tree can't function.
Yeah. Exactly. And
then you get those. It's like then you get those sort of negative. The story plays out in kind of an unhealthy way. But like to me, it seems like again that story of like relieving the pressure. It's not a bad one. Like it's not. It's just like it's not as precise as we are kind of mature enough to be right now. Like the Christian story seems to be just a more mature version of the story Girard discovered. It seems like to me.
Yeah, there's just so much in it, and all of the connections that you're seeing, that you're making, and the especially the insights into modern life. Like Girard was writing and speaking right up until 2015, and he saw so many of the things that are happening right now. Like he saw the like hyper fragment of Christianity that is social justice. Like he saw that already in the 1990s and before. He saw it happening, and he describes a lot of its nature in a really insightful, helpful way. And he also like had a lot of insights into all of the conflicts that are going on between people. You just find so much in his work. His work's quite annoying, in some ways, because it's very it's quite arrogant in some ways, but it's like well worth reading it. And I think that you would enjoy reading it. If you got past some of the technical theory, you would find a lot of stuff there that would connect with you.
Good. So where should I go next? What's the book I should read?
If you want to just read a short book, which is his summary, like that's his summary, you've got to read I See Satan Fall Like Lightning. And that's by Girard, and it's his kind of summary of all of his work and like what meaning it has.
Originally, that was by Jesus.
What's that?
I thought originally that quote was by Jesus.
Yeah. Yeah, it's from the Bible.
Okay, that's a great title. I'm intrigued.
It's a very beautiful, or very powerful image. Yeah, so like that's Yeah, I recommend that book as like a kind of introductory work. If you want to have something that's digestible, because it's not very long. If you want to read the rest of his work, you're looking at like 4 long books, really. They're quite technical. But
Well, I've
that
built a
should
pretty good
do
stack for myself to try to read through right now, so I should probably pick the short one.
Cool, man. Yeah, sounds sensible.
Good. Well, dude, thanks
guys,
so much
well,
for...
it was...
Oh, man. We're doing this again. I'll let you start.
Yeah, it was great talking to you, man. Maybe we'll do it again some other time. And good luck with your channel.
Thanks so much, man. Thanks for coming on.
Kept
Sweet.
with you guys for the most part.
Thanks, Evan.
No problem.
All right, see you later, guys.
Well, that was interesting. If you enjoyed this conversation, feel free to subscribe, like the video. Any kind of engagement really helps out with algorithm stuff as far as I'm aware. Another thing I'd love if you would do would be to share this video with someone who you think might find it interesting or specifically might disagree with it about something or disagree with you about something, and use it as a launch pad to have an interesting conversation, have an interesting disagreement maybe, because that's really what this whole thing is about for me. I think that having, honest disagreements is a really useful and meaningful thing to do. Anyways, thanks for watching. I'll see you next time.